these academics and instances that you cited received backlash for things that they said because people didn't agree with those things, I would say this isn't hindering their free expression. They can still present these views. They aren't exiled. They aren't governed. They aren't, locked behind bars, and they are able to say these things, even if they receive backlash for them.
So my name is Fred. I'm a student at Cambridge University, and I'm arguing in proposition for the statement, is political correctness hindering free expression?
Yeah, and my name is Liam Hoffman, and I'm an incoming student at Princeton University, and I will be arguing on the opposition of political correctness hindering free expression.
Liam, I have a kind of a 3-page proposition prepared, so I don't mind going first. Okay. Yeah, so all in all, I would like to kind of start my proposition by highlighting 3 parts of my debate. Firstly, I do want to back some consensus on some of the definition of the certain terms within the debate topic, and also kind of clarify the scopes of our debate and the key assumptions based on those definitions. And then secondly, I do want to provide some real-world examples to kind of support my proposition based on the scopes of our debate. And then thirdly and lastly, draw a conclusion based on the definitions, scope of the debate, and the real-life cases I've mentioned in the first 2 parts of my debate. So we know that the debate topic is political correctness hindering free expression? So there are 3 key terms I kind of want us to, have a consensus on, before we go into the normative arguments. So firstly is term political correctness. And I took the definition for political correctness from Oxford Languages, and it's defined as the conformity to prevailing liberal or radical opinion, in particular by carefully avoiding forms of expression or action that are perceived to exclude, marginalize, or insult groups of people who are socially disadvantaged and discriminated against. So that's the first definition. So the second definition for the second term is on hindering or hinder. Right? And the term definition for hindering from Oxford Languages is essentially the action of make it difficult for someone to do something or for something to happen. And the third term is free expression. And I agree this is, the most tricky part because, many people define, in different ways, but I define in 2 ways. So firstly, there's a legal definition regards to free expression, and it's, based upon the U.S. Constitution, the First Amendment. Freedom of speech essentially is the right to speak, write, and share ideas and opinions without facing punishment from the government. And of course, there are limitations to that, and the limitations are essentially obscenity, indecency, defamation, incitement, or fighting words. So this is the first legal definition for free expression. And the second definition, and I think is a lot more general, less legalistic, more colloquial and societal definition. And I define freedom of speech as, the right to speak, write, and share ideas and opinions without the fear of negative repercussions from any natural persons or public or private entities. So knowing these definitions, especially the variety of definition of free expression, I think there are 2 scopes of the debate, right? We can approach this debate from two sides. So firstly, is from the legal perspective. Right, we need to consider if political correctness impacts the legal right to free expression as defined by the First Amendment, which involves examining whether political correctness has led to laws or government actions that restrict speech, or whether the fear of legal repercussions based on political correctness hinders free expression. And the second scope is essentially, the social perspective of it. Right, we should also explore, the broader societal impact of political correctness on free expression, which includes understanding if political correctness creates an environment which individuals feel constrained by the fear of social backlash, professional consequences, or public shaming, even if there's no legal penalties involved. And because the debate, as we see it, didn't really specify where this political correctness is practiced and where geographically those free expressions are hindered as a result of that practice, I will kind of take a global approach in my examples that I'll mention below to kind of justify my proposition based on the 2 scopes of arguments that I mentioned before. So the great example, I think, to demonstrate how political correctness hinders free expression from both a legal and social perspective is the case of Ai Weiwei. So Ai Weiwei is a Chinese artist, is a contemporary artist in exile as a result of his criticism towards his government's stance on democracy and human rights. So from this, from a legal perspective, Ai Weiwei's failure to be politically correct based on his government's agenda has led him to negative punishments, including prison times, which hinders his ability to express his thoughts freely. So, however, while on exile, once he comes to the West.
Yeah, so just like to touch on that real quick and just ask a quick question. So you mentioned this example of Ai Weiwei and him being exiled by the Chinese government. Would you say this really like this example of him not following the ideas of his government and speaking out against their anti-democratic and anti-human rights focused actions is really an example of him not following political correctness, or like this idea of political correctness that you laid out earlier, where it's kind of following this idea of not offending people based off of certain characteristics that they have, or falling under this kind of like liberal view of things that are acceptable to say in a social setting.
Give me 1 second. Can you hear me still? Yeah, so to respond to that, I think again there are two definitions, I guess like two perspectives on this, right? You have the legal perspective, which what is political correctness is essentially like following what the government wants, right? What the government think is correct. So in the case of Ai Weiwei, he basically went against that exact same thing, right? So basically, his freedom of expression, based on the legal definition of freedom of expression, is limited as a result of him not following the political correctness that is defined by his government. So in that case, I think his speech is limited as a result of his expression of his own ideas. And then to continue with my example, after he come to the western end of the earth, his speech was again kind of limited on the soft or social censorship as a result of his speech. And a really good example that I think we should evaluate is his tweet on Israel and Hamas conflict recently last year, which has led to the cancellation of his art exhibition in the Listen Gallery in London in November 2023. So in this case, from a social perspective, right, the social definition of freedom of expression, Ai Weiwei's failure to be politically correct based on the Western social societal agenda has led to the negative professional consequences that kind of hinders his ability to express his thoughts freely, right? And I think, Ai Weiwei's case is not the only one that kind of demonstrates the negative impact of PC on speech defined in both legal and colloquial terms. Some of the other examples that I can give is Liu Xiaobo's imprisonment under the charge of inciting subversion of state power for his manifesto calling for political and greater human rights in his country. Pu Zhiqiang's imprisonment under the charge of inciting ethnic hatred and picking quarrels and provoking trouble based on his online posts criticizing government policies. And then, in the United States, you have James Damore firing from Google after he wrote an internal memo suggesting that a biological difference might explain why there are fewer women in tech and leadership positions, and Professor Brett Weinstein's resignation after receiving significant backlash for his objection to a campus event that really just asked white people to stay off campus for a day. And I think these are some examples that really show how PC have hindered free speech in both free speech that's defined by both legal and colloquial terms. And indeed, we can argue that some of these aforementioned speeches do pose harm towards some groups of people that it's been targeting, right? Therefore, their speech should be somewhat restricted, regulated, or censored, or content moderated, right? But I think, if we bring back to the topic of the debate, we're not really judging the goodness or badness of political correctness hindering free expression, right? We're not placing a value on whether it is good that PC is hindering freedom of expression, or it is a bad thing that PC is hindering expression, but rather we're trying to find whether there's any existing facts that demonstrate or allude that PC is hindering free expression without assigning a value to it. And I think, based on the examples that I've cited before, it is kind of fair to say that PC is hindering free expression in both legal and colloquial terms. Uh, so yeah, and I will pass it to you, Liam.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah. So I'm just going to go ahead and kind of go down like your flow of debate and offer my thoughts on it as the opposition, and kind of give you a couple of thoughts on my own why I don't really think this political correctness as we see it and as we kind of typically know it is really hindering free speech. So right off the bat, you offered definitions. I agree with your definitions provided by political correctness. I think it is kind of this like conformity to what we deem as like socially acceptable without really offending people. I agree with that definition, and I agree with as well as how you define hindering and free expression really. But I think the examples that you provided sometimes don't really fall under those definitions, and I'll get that into that in a minute. Um, I agree with your two scopes, right? Of focusing kind of on legality, on the legal framework, and I understand. We need to focus, kind of at free expression as we know it legally, and broader social impact of like this political correctness. I would like to go into kind of just free expression as we know it legally, right? Free expression, obviously, total 100% free expression doesn't exist, but it looks like you being able to say literally whatever you want, whenever you want, right? Classic example, you can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater, and that's that is hindering our free expression, but we don't argue it, and everyone's basically come to a consensus that we can limit freedom of speech and free expression here in this instance, and in many other instances we see that take hold as well. So given that free expression is sometimes hindered, and there is reasons that it is hindered, and those reasons are widely accepted as being positive, I would like to say that if we look at, and if we acknowledge that something is hindering free expression, if political correctness is hindering free expression, and we acknowledge that, and we say this is hindering the free expression that people should be able to access and should be able to have, then you have to start looking at, is this moral to say this? Is this okay? Is this political correctness hurting free expression in a way that negatively impacts people's rights that they should reasonably have, right? So, if political correctness is saying, no, you can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater, then it is certainly okay to say that it's hindering free expression. But it's also something that, we admit and say, yes, it's hindering free expression. That's okay. If political correctness is hindering things that are negative to society, if it's things that people shouldn't be able to say and shouldn't, really be said because we have moved past those types of ideas as a society and as a world, then I think you have to start looking at, okay, do we really want to say that it's hindering free expression? Do we really want to say that it's hindering people's rights? Because at the point where we say it's hindering people's rights, you're going to start to see political correctness pushed back against, and we're going to move into a world where we don't acknowledge it as a hindrance of free expression, and people can go ahead and say that. So given that, I think the examples that you provided were certainly plentiful. And they included many examples of like government prosecution, as well as people receiving backlash for things that they said or things that they spoke out against. So first, I'd like to focus on those examples you provided of like this government prosecution. I would say, sure, this is technically political correctness in the sense that Ai Weiwei is speaking out against his government. Yeah, he's going and saying things that his government doesn't agree with, and as a result, his freedom of expression is hindered because he is exiled from the country. Yeah, I think that is certainly a hindrance of free expression. I don't really think that this is like the political correctness that we really see focused on today. I would argue, certainly you can say that that's hindering free expression and receive almost no debate on that, because that is obviously a hindrance of free expression. I think the political correctness that we're looking at today is more so people being denounced and being pushed back against for views that don't conform to these like social norms and don't conform to these things that really make all people feel welcome and comfortable, kind of like you laid out earlier in your speech. So on that note as well, the people that receive backlash for the things that they said and for views that they had, I think that this backlash that they received isn't a hindrance to their free expression at the point where they could receive backlash for almost, you could receive academic backlash for saying something that academics don't really agree with. These academics and instances that you cited received backlash for things that they said because people didn't agree with those things. I would say this isn't hindering their free expression. They can still present these views. They aren't exiled. They aren't governed. They aren't, locked behind bars. And they are able to say these things, even if they receive backlash for them. I think that.
Oh, sorry to cut it off, Liam. I apologize. Yeah, give me 1 second. Can you hear me still? Oh, yeah, perfect. Awesome. Yeah, so just to make one note that I think, like everybody's free to say anything, right? So I think one point that Nathan Law actually put it that I found pretty interesting in his debate at Cambridge was that, in China, you also can argue there's freedom of expression and freedom of speech, but you can only speak freely once, and then you will never be able to speak again, right? So I think it's the level of freedom that we are talking about, and also in terms of backlash, right? Like the level of backlash. If there's one backlash, then we can say there is a backlash, right? No matter whether it's a severe backlash or like a minimum amount of backlash, but there exists a backlash. So based on that term, that's the reason why I think there is this kind of hindrance. No matter the hindrance is, a greater amount, a smaller amount, there exists this hindrance. So yes, I'll pass the mic to you again. Sorry to interrupt.
No worries. Yeah. So can you hear me? Perfect. All right. Yeah. So no, definitely. I think there is this level of backlash, and people do receive backlash for actions that they've made and decisions that they've made, and things that they've spoken out against. I would say this backlash, is a lot different than government prosecution, speaking out against the government. I would say backlash for being an academic and saying something that might not be politically correct or might not be deemed as socially acceptable by like a large majority of the population doesn't really hinder your free speech. You're still able to present those views. And a lot of times these examples of political correctness completely hindering freedom of speech really fall short when you look at the fact that the people that make these like politically incorrect statements oftentimes have support, and they have people that are backing them and displaying these viewpoints. You see it all the time in the United States. Politicians are making statements that are deemed as politically correct by half of the population and deemed as politically incorrect by the other half of the population. I would say this political correctness isn't really hindering their free speech, even if they receive backlash for it, and even if people come out and say, "Hey, you as a politician and as a leader in this country shouldn't really be saying these things." I think that's different than completely shutting off someone's freedom of speech and freedom of expression, with things like government prosecution. I would also kind of like to touch on this idea, like that idea that you offered at the very end, where we're not really debating the morality of political correctness. I say, sure, we're not really debating the morality of political correctness, but I do think that saying that it hinders free expression, if we as a society admit that it hinders free expression, you start to see pushback on political correctness. You start to see its value and its practice lessened in society. Whereas if you say that it's not hindering free expression, political correctness continues to take hold. As a society, as like people, if we admit that something's hindering a basic right that we have, it's obviously going to be pushed back against. Again, going back to the example of shouting fire at a movie theater, we never really hear people saying this is violating my freedom of speech, even though it technically is. If people were to start arguing that this violates freedom of speech and basic human rights that people should have, we would probably start to see laws be put in place where, now you can shout fire in a movie theater. Obviously, that's an extreme example, not going to happen, but it's, kind of follows the flow of what we see with political correctness. So with that being said, I would just kind of like to move into a couple closing arguments, like on my side, a couple like ideas that I would like to, present. So on one side, you have kind of this idea of like, what is free expression? What is political correctness? We've touched on it, we've defined it, but we haven't really, kind of seen what it looks like in the real world, kind of, what it is, like big picture. Like I would say freedom of expression, you have the dictionary definition, but it also, it is just including the idea that you can express like your opinions, you can express what you want. I would say political correctness doesn't really hinder this type of like free expression and this type of being able to say what you want, because it is hindering instead, like you said earlier, comments that are being made that may be deemed as socially unacceptable. This isn't really, it might be people's opinions. It might be things that people that people feel. But most of the time, political correctness looks like simply, using terms and using ideologies that really like they'll fall flat, today. It looks like, being able to use certain words or not being able to use certain words because those are deemed socially unacceptable. I would also say one closing argument is, again, that like freedom of expression, this political correctness fosters a society that is more accepting, that deems people's opinions and states of being as legitimate and doesn't discriminate against them. When you have that start to happen, people feel more comfortable expressing their ideas. When they aren't being called certain things that they don't want to be called, they can express their ideas, and they have, because of that, more freedom of expression.
Yeah, thank you, Liam. And I want to end kind of this debate by asking one question. Do you think that the fact that the Listen Gallery in London canceling Ai Weiwei's art exhibition as a result of his speech, not a form of hindrance of his free expression, given that presenting his art at the exhibition is a form of expression? So I will leave that question there. I think you're running out of time, but if you can give a thumb up or thumb down.